The day I discovered I'd been replaced by a ghost was also the day I learned how deeply a mother's love could twist into something unrecognizable. I was 16, crouched behind the mahogany credenza in my father's study, when I heard my stepmother Petra's voice drift through the crack beneath the door. Isaac, darling, we need to discuss Claire's future, or rather, our son's future. I froze, my hand still clutching the fountain pen I'd snuck in to borrow. Our son? Petra had been trying to conceive for years without success, but this was the first I'd heard of any pregnancy. She's just not suitable, Petra continued. A girl can't carry on the Hanson legacy the way a son would. When our boy comes, he'll need everything we can give him. My father's chair creaked, that familiar sound I'd grown up hearing whenever he was deep in thought. Claire's my daughter Petra, my only child. For now, Petra's voice hardened. But she's soft, Isaac, too concerned with her environmental causes and social justice. Is that really who you want running your company? I'm Claire, by the way, the daughter who apparently wasn't enough. The girl who spent her childhood following her father around his manufacturing plant, learning every aspect of the family business, only to be rendered invisible by the promise of a son who didn't even exist. Perhaps you're right, my father finally said, and my world cracked in half. A son would be traditional, proper. I bit my lip so hard I tasted blood. Through the gap under the door, I watched their shadows merge and separate as Petra moved around the study. We'll need to adjust your will, she said. Set aside the bulk of the inheritance for our future son. Claire can have a small allowance, of course. We're not monsters. My father's laugh was hollow. She won't like it. She doesn't have to like it. She just has to accept it. I didn't realize I was crying until a tear splashed onto my hand. The fountain pen I'd been clutching left ink stains on my fingers. The same fingers that used to hold my father's hand during our weekend walks, back when I was his whole world. That evening at dinner, I watched them both with new eyes. Petra wore her usual perfect smile, asking about my day with practiced maternal concern. My father avoided my gaze, suddenly fascinated by his roast beef. I'm thinking of applying to law school, I announced, breaking their carefully orchestrated small talk. Environmental law, specifically. Petra's fork clattered against her plate. Oh, sweetie, wouldn't business school be more appropriate? Your father's company will go to my brother, won't it? I met my father's eyes directly. The son you're planning to have? The color drained from both their faces. My father recovered first, straightening his spine like he did before every board meeting. You were eavesdropping. And you were plotting to disinherit me for a child who doesn't exist. My voice didn't shake. I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Claire, Petra reached across the table, her perfectly manicured nails gleaming under the chandelier light. You don't understand. A family legacy. Stop. I pushed back from the table, the legs of my chair scraping against hardwood. Just stop pretending you care about me. I heard everything. My father finally found his voice. Sit down, Claire. We can discuss this rationally. Rationally? I laughed, and it sounded foreign to my own ears. There's nothing rational about choosing a fictional son over your real daughter. I walked out of that dining room with my head high, ignoring their calls to come back. In my bedroom, I pulled out the college acceptance letters I'd been hiding. Yale, Stanford, Columbia, all offering scholarships. I'd applied in secret, knowing this day would come, though I hadn't expected it to hurt quite so much. That night, as I packed my bags, I heard them arguing in their bedroom. Petra's voice rose above my father's attempts to shush her. She's ungrateful after everything we've done. Everything you've done, I whispered to myself, taping up another box, is show me exactly who you are. The next morning, I left before dawn. I took only what I could fit in my car: clothes, books, and the photo album from before Petra, when it was just Dad and me. I left a note on my pillow. Dear Father, I hope your son is everything you dreamed he'd be. Don't worry about my inheritance. I'll build my own legacy. Claire. As I drove away from the mansion that had never really felt like home, I caught a glimpse of my father in the window. He looked small somehow, diminished by the first light of dawn. Petra stood behind him, one hand on his shoulder, already the victor in a battle I hadn't known we were fighting. But that was okay. They wanted a son who would carry on the family name? Fine. I would become something better, someone who would make them wish they hadn't thrown away the daughter they had for the son they would never have. 12 years can change everything and nothing at all. I was sorting through case files in my office when Yasmin burst through the door, waving an envelope like a victory flag. Claire, you're not going to believe what just landed on my desk. She slapped the cream-colored envelope onto my mahogany desk, identical to the one I used to hide behind in my father's study. It's from Malcolm. My stomach twisted at the name. Malcolm, my father's longtime lawyer, the man who had helped draft the will that had written me out of my own family's legacy. Throw it away. It's marked urgent. Yasmin perched on the edge of my desk, her legal assistant badge swinging from her neck. And it's about your father. The familiar ache returned, the one I thought I'd buried under years of case wins and environmental victories. Unless he's finally had that mythical son he always wanted, I'm not interested. Claire, Yasmin's voice softened. He had a stroke. The world tilted slightly. I steadied myself against my desk, feeling the smooth surface under my palms. When? 3 days ago. He's stable, but... She pushed the envelope closer. Malcolm says there are things you need to know. Before I could respond, Brendan appeared in my doorway, his tie loosened after a long day in court. Ready to prep for the Thompson case? The logging company's lawyers are. Claire, you okay? I realized I was still staring at the envelope. I'm fine, just family stuff. Family stuff? Brendan raised an eyebrow. In the 12 years you've worked here, you've never once mentioned family. Because I don't have any. I grabbed my jacket. The Thompson case is more important. No, it's not. Brendan stepped fully into my office, closing the door behind him. Take the rest of the day. Deal with this. There's nothing to deal with. But my hands were already opening the envelope, Malcolm's precise handwriting swimming before my eyes. Dear Claire, your father's condition is serious. Before the stroke, he made changes to his will that you need to be aware of. Please come home. There are things that need to be said in person. Malcolm, home, I scoffed, crumpling the letter. That place hasn't been home since I was 16. Then maybe it's time to make peace with that, Yasmin said quietly, or at least get closure. I looked around my office, at the environmental law degrees on the wall, the framed newspaper articles about our victories against corporate polluters. I built all this without them. I don't need. Cut the crap, Brendan interrupted. You've spent 12 years fighting for other people's justice. Maybe it's time to fight for your own. My phone buzzed. A text from Petra, first contact in over a decade. Your father is asking for you. Don't make him beg. Manipulative as ever, I muttered, but my resolve was cracking. Take my car, Yasmin offered, dangling her keys. It's better for long drives than your eco-friendly hybrid. I haven't said I'm going. You don't have to, she smiled. Your face did. 2 hours later, I was on the highway, watching familiar landmarks scroll past. The old manufacturing plant where I used to spend summers with Dad. The park where he taught me to ride a bike. The coffee shop where I'd worked my first job, determined to prove I could make it on my own. My phone rang through the car speakers. Claire speaking. It's Malcolm. Are you coming? Why the sudden urgency? After 12 years of radio silence, there was a pause. Things change, Claire. People change. Your father, he's not the same man who let you walk away. He didn't let me walk away, I corrected, gripping the steering wheel tighter. He pushed me out for a son who never existed. And now he's asking for you. Just you. Doesn't that tell you something? I clicked off the call, not ready for the hope those words triggered. The last time I'd hoped, I'd ended up hiding behind furniture, learning I wasn't enough for my own father. The mansion appeared around the next bend, exactly as I remembered it. Petra's precious rose gardens still lined the driveway, though they looked wilder now, less controlled, like something fighting to break free from its prescribed boundaries. As I parked, the front door opened. Petra stood there, her perfect posture unchanged, though her hair had gone gray at the temples. Claire, you came. Not for you. She flinched but held her ground. He's in his study, the same one where I learned the truth. I brushed past her, the familiar scent of her perfume making me nauseous. Don't worry, Petra. I'm not here to stake any claims. I just want to know what was so important Malcolm had to break 12 years of silence. Claire, she called after me. There's something you should know before. But I was already pushing open the study door, where the mahogany credenza still stood guard over family secrets, and my father waited with whatever truth he thought was worth 12 years of absence. The study looked smaller than I remembered. My father sat in his wheelchair by the window, a blanket draped across his legs, his once commanding presence diminished by illness. When he turned to face me, the right side of his mouth drooped slightly, the only visible sign of his stroke. Claire, he said, his voice raspy but clear, you look successful. That's what happens when you have to make it on your own. I remained standing, arms crossed. Malcolm said something about changes to your will? Always straight to business. He attempted a smile. Like your old man. I'm nothing like you. No, he agreed, surprising me. You're better, stronger. I've followed your career, you know. Every case, every victory. I hadn't expected that. You've been keeping tabs on me? The brilliant environmental lawyer taking down corporate giants? He gestured to a stack of newspapers on his desk. You've made quite a name for yourself. That's not why I'm here. No. He wheeled himself closer. You're here because I finally realized what a fool I've been. Petra, don't. I held up a hand. I don't want to hear about Petra or your imaginary son or there was never gonna be a son. His words stopped me cold. Petra couldn't have children. We knew that 3 months after we married. The room spun slightly. What? It was her idea, the fictional son. She thought, he coughed, and I instinctively stepped forward before catching myself. She thought if I believed we'd have a son, I'd change the will, secure her future. And you went along with it? My voice cracked. You chose a lie over your own daughter? I was weak. He reached for a folder on his desk, hands trembling. But I'm trying to make it right. Malcolm has drawn up new papers. The company, the estate, everything goes to you. I don't want it. Then change it, sell it, turn it into one of your environmental projects. He pushed the folder toward me. Just don't walk away again. A knock at the door interrupted us. Malcolm entered, his suit as impeccable as ever, though his hairline had receded significantly since I'd last seen him. The papers are ready, he said, nodding to me. Everything's in order. What papers? Petra appeared behind him, her face tight with concern. Isaac, you're supposed to be resting. I'm making things right, my father said firmly. The company goes to Claire. All of it. Petra's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the panic beneath. But we discussed this. The community foundation. Will be Claire's decision. He turned to me. The company's practices haven't been environmentally sound. Perhaps you could help with that. I picked up the folder, scanning the documents inside. Everything was there. Full control of the company, the estate, all assets. A complete reversal of the will that had driven me away 12 years ago. This is what you wanted to tell me? I looked at Malcolm. This is why you reached out? He shifted uncomfortably. There's more. The original will. I helped draft it, knowing it was wrong. I've carried that guilt for 12 years. We all have our burdens, I said coldly. Claire? My father wheeled closer. I know this doesn't make up for. Suddenly, he clutched his chest, his face contorting in pain. The folder fell from my hands as I rushed to his side. Dad! Petra was already calling for an ambulance. Malcolm helped me move him to the couch while we waited, his breathing labored but stable. The stress, Petra muttered. I told you this was too much at once. No, my father grabbed my hand. Had to make it right. The paramedics arrived quickly, efficiently transferring him onto a stretcher. As they wheeled him out, he kept his eyes on me. Stay, he whispered. Please. I found myself nodding, though everything in me screamed to run. Once the ambulance left, I turned to Malcolm. Tell me everything, no more secrets. He glanced at Petra, who had sunk into my father's wheelchair, looking suddenly old. Perhaps we should discuss this privately. No, Petra straightened. She deserves to know about the foundation, about what I've been doing with company funds, about everything. What about the company funds? I asked sharply. Malcolm pulled out another folder. That's the other reason your father wanted you here. There are discrepancies, large ones, and given your experience with corporate law, I took the folder, already seeing where this was headed. My father hadn't just given me an inheritance. He'd handed me a mystery to solve, and judging by Petra's expression, she was at the center of it. I'll need an office, I said, watching her face pale further, and access to all company records. Of course, Malcolm replied. Everything you need. I walked to the credenza, running my fingers along its familiar surface. Well, Petra, looks like you'll get to work with a Hanson heir after all, just not the one you were hoping for. The company records told a story of systematic deception. I sat in my father's office, my office now, surrounded by financial statements and transfer records, each one revealing another layer of Petra's web. Found something interesting? Malcolm stood in the doorway, 2 cups of coffee in hand. Interesting is one word for it. I held up a document. Care to explain why my father's company has been making monthly payments to a shell corporation called Future Legacy Holdings? He set the coffee down, loosening his tie. That would be Petra's pet project. Pet project? I pulled up more records on my laptop. Try Slush Fund. She's been siphoning money for years, all under the guise of a community foundation that doesn't actually exist. Your father trusted her. And you? I met his eyes. What's your excuse for not catching this? Before he could answer, Petra swept into the office, immaculate as always. Claire, darling, visiting hours at the hospital start soon. Shall we sit down? I pointed to the chair across from me. We need to talk about Future Legacy Holdings. The color drained from her face, but she recovered quickly. A legitimate business venture. A fraud. I spread the documents across the desk. $6 million, Petra. That's how much you've diverted. Care to explain where it went? Everything I did was for this family's future. You mean your future. I pulled out my phone, showing her the photos I'd taken. Nice vacation home in the Cayman Islands. Interesting choice of location, considering it's a popular tax haven. She gripped the arms of her chair. You don't understand. Your father, he was going to leave me nothing. After everything I sacrificed. Sacrificed? I laughed harshly. You manipulated him into disinheriting his only child for a son you knew you couldn't have. You stole millions from his company. What exactly did you sacrifice? My youth, she stood abruptly. 20 years I spent managing this family's reputation, hosting their parties, playing the perfect wife while you got to run off and play environmental warrior. Play? I stood too, matching her height. I built a career. I fought for what I believed in. You just took what wasn't yours. Malcolm cleared his throat. Perhaps we should stay out of this, Petra snapped. You're as guilty as anyone. Who do you think helped me set up those offshore accounts? I turned to Malcolm, who suddenly couldn't meet my eyes. Is that true? I was compensated for my discretion. Perfect. I sat back down, pulling out my phone again. That makes this next part easier. What next part? Petra demanded. I'm calling the police. I held up my hand as she started to protest. But I'm willing to make a deal first. That got their attention. Both sat down, waiting. The Community Foundation, I said. Let's make it real. What? Petra blinked. $6 million, plus the estate itself. We turn it into an actual environmental education center. You both sign confessions detailing your roles in the fraud, which I'll keep unless you try to interfere. You're blackmailing us? Malcolm looked almost impressed. I'm offering you a chance to do the right thing. I pulled out the paperwork I'd spent all night preparing. Sign these, and your reputation stay intact. Refuse, and I go public with everything. Petra leaned forward. You'd really destroy your father's company's reputation just to spite me? No, I'd transform it into something meaningful. I met her gaze steadily, which is more than you ever tried to do. Malcolm reached for the papers first. Where do I sign? Malcolm! Petra grabbed his arm. We can fight this. She has no proof that would stand up in court. She has enough. He picked up a pen. And I'm tired of carrying this guilt. I watched him sign, then turned to Petra. Your choice, but make it fast. Visiting hours at the hospital start soon, and I'd rather tell my father about the new community center than about his wife's embezzlement scheme. She stared at the papers for a long moment. I get to stay in the guest house. As long as you work at the center. Real work, Petra. No more schemes. Another long pause. Then she snatched the pen from Malcolm. You're more like your father than you know. He could be ruthless, too, when he wanted something. No, I watched her signature join Malcolm's. I'm what you made me. Congratulations. As they left my office, I picked up my phone to call Yasmin. She answered on the first ring. Well, how bad is it? Bad enough. I looked out the window at the estate grounds, but I think I just found a way to turn all this poison into something good. How do you feel about helping me start an environmental education center? Are you kidding? I'll call Brendan right now. We can have proposals ready by... First, I interrupted, gathering my things. I need to tell my father. He should hear it from me before anyone else. How is he? I paused at the door, looking back at the office where so much damage had been done. Getting better, we both are. My father's hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors. He looked better today, sitting up in bed, a newspaper spread across his lap. The community center, he said as I walked in. It's a good idea. I stopped short. How did you? Petra called. He folded the newspaper carefully. She was quite vocal about your methods of persuasion. Dad, I can explain. No need. He gestured to the chair beside his bed. I knew about the embezzlement, not the full extent, but enough. I sat down, stunned. You knew? Why didn't you stop it? Because I deserved it. He met my eyes. After what I did to you, letting Petra steal from me seemed like appropriate punishment. Before I could respond, there was a knock at the door. Leandro, the local community organizer I'd contacted, stepped in. "Sorry I'm early," he said, tablet in hand, "but I've got some exciting proposals for the center's programs." "Perfect timing." I waved him in. "Dad, this is Leandro. He's helping design the educational initiatives." Leandro pulled up a chair, his enthusiasm infectious. "Mr. Hanson, your estate's location is perfect. The wetlands at the back of the property alone could support multiple conservation programs." "Wetlands?" My father frowned. Petra always called that the waste area. "Because she couldn't develop it," I explained. "Environmental protection laws." "Which is exactly why it's perfect for education," Leandro added. "We can teach about ecosystem preservation, sustainable development." Another knock interrupted us. Brendan entered, followed by Yasmin. "Sorry to crash the party," Brendan said, "but we've got a situation." Yasmin held up her phone. "Petra's called an emergency board meeting. She's trying to challenge the transfer of ownership." "She can't," my father said sharply. "I signed." "She's claiming you weren't competent due to your stroke." Brendan pulled out some papers. "We need to move fast." I stood up. "When's the meeting?" 2 hours. Yasmin checked her watch. "Just enough time to prepare if we start now." "Go," my father urged. "Show them what you can do." Leandro gathered his things. "I'll come too. The board should hear directly from community stakeholders." We rushed to the company headquarters, where Malcolm met us in the lobby. "Petra's gathered quite a crowd," he warned. "Board members, shareholders, even local press." "Good." I straightened my jacket. "More witnesses to her desperation." The boardroom was packed. Petra sat at the head of the table, playing her role of grieving wife perfectly. "Claire," she said sweetly, "we're just trying to protect your father's interests while he's unwell. By undermining his wishes?" I took my place at the opposite end. "Let's be clear about what's happening here. You're not protecting anyone but yourself. The board has concerns." She gestured to the serious faces around us. "About your radical environmental agenda." "My agenda?" I opened my laptop, connecting it to the projector. "Let's talk about agendas, specifically your offshore accounts." The room erupted in murmurs as I displayed the financial records. "That's confidential information." Petra stood up. "Actually," Brendan stepped forward, "as acting CEO, Claire has every right to share evidence of financial misconduct with the board." "And that's not all," Leandro added, pulling up his own presentation. "We've calculated the potential positive economic impact of the community center on local property values and business growth. For the next hour, we laid out everything: Petra's fraud, the environmental center's benefits, the potential for positive press and community goodwill. With each point, I watched board members lean forward, their expressions shifting from skepticism to interest. "The choice is simple," I concluded. "Continue enabling fraud and environmental degradation, or be part of something transformative." "This is ridiculous," Petra snapped. "You're all falling for her act? She abandoned this company for 12 years. "Because you drove her away," Malcolm spoke up, surprising everyone. "And now she's back, offering us a chance at redemption. I, for one, am taking it." The board voted overwhelmingly in my favor. As people filed out, Petra remained seated, staring at her hands. "You won," she said quietly. "Happy now?" "This isn't about winning." I gathered my things. "It's about fixing what's broken, including this family if you'll let me." She looked up, and for the first time, I saw real tears in her eyes. "Why would you want to fix anything with me?" "Because holding on to hate is exhausting," I said, "and I've got better things to do with my energy." Later, back in my father's hospital room, I told him everything. "Petra will come around," he said confidently. "She's always been a survivor." "Maybe," I showed him Leandro's designs for the center. "But for now, let's focus on building something new." He smiled, reaching for my hand. I'm proud of you, Claire. I should have said that years ago. Better late than never. I squeezed his hand. We've got time to make up for everything we missed. The first sign of trouble came 3 weeks into the community center's renovation. I arrived at the estate to find the construction crew standing idle, their equipment silent. What's going on? I asked the foreman. Anonymous tip to the building department, he said, handing me a stack of papers. Someone reported multiple code violations. We're shut down until inspection. I flipped through the documents, my jaw tightening. Let me guess. The tip came from a woman with perfect posture and expensive perfume? Can't say. He shrugged. But your stepmother was here yesterday taking pictures. I pulled out my phone to call Brendan, but Yasmin's number flashed on the screen first. Turn on the local news, she said without greeting. Now. I rushed to my office, flicking on the TV. There was Petra, perfectly composed in a press conference outside the company headquarters. As a longtime member of this community, she was saying, I cannot in good conscience allow this reckless development to proceed. The environmental center poses serious risks to local groundwater. She's lying. Leandro burst into my office, waving environmental impact reports. We've done all the proper surveys. The site is clean. Of course she's lying. I turned up the volume as Petra continued. Furthermore, I have evidence that Claire Hansen's takeover of the company was facilitated through coercion and threats. My phone buzzed again. Malcolm this time. Don't respond publicly, he warned. She's trying to provoke you into making a mistake. Too late, I grabbed my keys. I'm going down there. Claire, wait! But I was already moving, anger propelling me forward. At the headquarters, reporters swarmed around Petra, who looked almost gleeful at the chaos she'd created. Claire, she called out as I approached. How nice of you to join us. Care to comment on the environmental violations? Actually, yes. I stepped up to the microphones. I'd love to discuss environmental violations, specifically the ones your administration covered up for the past decade. Her smile faltered slightly. I don't know what the toxic waste dumping behind the manufacturing plant? I pulled out my phone, displaying photos. The falsified emissions reports? Should we talk about those? The reporters turned their cameras toward the images, questions flying. That's all ancient history. Petra tried to wave it off. The soil samples I took last week say different. I nodded to Leandro, who started distributing reports to the press. But you knew that, didn't you? That's why you're so desperate to stop the community center. An environmental education facility would mean regular testing of the entire property. You're trying to destroy your father's legacy, she snapped. No, I'm trying to save it, and you're trying to hide evidence of criminal negligence. Suddenly, Malcolm appeared at my side. The police are here, he muttered, with warrants. Sure enough, police cars pulled up to the building. Petra's face went ash white. You didn't, she whispered. I didn't have to, I replied. Turns out your friend in the building department has a conscience. He took those soil samples to the EPA. As the officers approached, Petra grabbed my arm. Wait, we can make a deal. Like the deal you made with my father, manipulating him when he was vulnerable? You don't understand. Her voice cracked. I needed security. If something happened to him, then you should have built something real. I pulled away. Instead of stealing and lying, the police led her away, reporters capturing every moment. Malcolm touched my shoulder. There's something else you should know, he said quietly. She tried to alter your father's medical records, make it look like he wasn't competent when he signed the company over. My blood ran cold. When? Yesterday. But the head nurse caught it. She's the one who called the EPA. I watched Petra being placed in a police car, her perfect facade finally crumbling. Part of me felt hollow, not victorious, just tired. What happens now? Leandro asked, joining us. Now? I turned to the reporters still hovering nearby. Now we tell the real story about transformation and redemption, about turning a site of environmental abuse into one of education and healing. And Petra? She'll face consequences, Malcolm said. We all will for what we've done. I faced the cameras, ready to reshape the narrative. My father's company spent years putting profit over planet. We're going to change that, starting with full transparency about past violations and a comprehensive cleanup plan. Later that evening, I sat with my father in his hospital room, watching the news coverage. You didn't tell me about the toxic dumping, I said. He looked away. I was ashamed. It was easier to let Petra handle things, to not look too closely. Well, now we look at everything. I took his hand. Together. Together, he agreed, then smiled slightly. You know, for someone who claims not to be like me, you certainly know how to take control of a situation. Maybe, I squeezed his hand, but I'm using that power to build something better. That's the difference. Outside his window, the sun set over the estate grounds, where tomorrow, despite Petra's schemes, work would begin again on transforming poison into possibility. The courthouse buzzed with tension as Petra's trial began. I sat in the front row, watching her enter in handcuffs, her designer outfit replaced by something far more modest. My father sat beside me in his wheelchair, finally strong enough to attend. The state calls Claire Hansen to the stand. I walked to the witness box, feeling Petra's eyes follow me. Her lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Rita, approached. Ms. Hansen, isn't it true that you abandoned your family's company for 12 years? Objection. Relevance? Our prosecutor stood. Goes to motive, Your Honor, Rita replied. The witness's grudge against my client. I'll allow it. The judge nodded. Answer the question. I left, I said clearly, because I discovered my stepmother and father had conspired to disinherit me in favor of a fictional son. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Rita pressed on. And when you returned, you immediately began looking for ways to discredit Mrs. Hansen? No, I began looking into company records because my father asked me to. That's when I discovered the environmental violations and financial fraud. Convenient timing. The truth usually is. I met Petra's gaze, just like it was convenient that the building inspector found those soil samples right when you were trying to stop the community center. Rita paused. Are you suggesting my client orchestrated her own downfall? I'm stating that karma has perfect timing. The questioning continued for hours. They brought up my environmental activism, suggesting I had a vendetta against industrial companies. They questioned my motives, my character, even my relationship with my father. Then Malcolm took the stand. Mr. Williams, the prosecutor began, please tell us about Future Legacy Holdings. Malcolm glanced at Petra before speaking. It was a shell corporation created to hide diverted company funds. I helped set it up under Mrs. Hansen's direction. And the environmental violations? She ordered the falsification of reports to avoid cleanup costs. Said it would, he swallowed hard, would hurt the company's value for her future son. Petra stood up suddenly. He's lying. Isaac, tell them he's lying. Order! The judge banged his gavel. Mrs. Hansen, sit down or you'll be removed. The evidence mounted. Doctored financial records, falsified environmental reports, attempted manipulation of medical records. With each revelation, Petra seemed to shrink in her chair. During a recess, Leandro rushed in with news from the estate. The cleanup crew found more drums of waste, he reported. Hidden under the old storage facility. It's worse than we thought. How much worse? My father asked. $3 million to clean up, minimum. And that's just what we've found so far. I watched Petra being led back into the courtroom. Still think I'm destroying your legacy, Petra? Or were you handling that just fine on your own? The jury took only 2 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty on all counts: fraud, environmental violations, attempted medical record tampering. Before sentencing, the judge looked at Petra. Would you like to make a statement? She stood slowly, her perfect posture finally broken. I never meant, I just wanted to belong, to secure my place. Isaac gave me everything, but it never felt real without a son. I finished for her. She turned to me, tears streaming down her face. You were already grown. You didn't need a mother. I needed someone who would need me. The defendant is sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, the judge declared, plus restitution of all embezzled funds. As they led Petra away, my father gripped my hand. I should have protected you from this, from her. No, I helped him navigate his wheelchair through the crowd. We should have faced it together, but we can do that now. Outside, reporters waited with cameras and questions. Brendan appeared, creating a path through them. The Environmental Center's board meeting starts in an hour, he reminded me. Ready to show them the new plans? I looked at my father. Want to help me present the cleanup strategy? He smiled. Wouldn't miss it. As we drove to the estate, passing the construction equipment already at work, my father spoke quietly. You know, I kept waiting for the son Petra promised, thinking he would somehow fix everything: the company, the family, my mistakes. But you were there all along, doing exactly that. Not fixing, I corrected, pulling up to the mansion that would soon become a beacon of environmental education. Transforming. There's a difference. There certainly is. He looked at the property with new eyes. Speaking of transformation, what should we do with Petra's rose gardens? I smiled, thinking of the perfectly manicured flowers she'd use to mark her territory. I'm thinking a butterfly sanctuary, something beautiful and free. The board members were already gathering inside, ready to hear our vision for the future. But first, I had one more stop to make. I walked to the old credenza in my father's study, my study now, and ran my fingers along its surface one last time. Ready? My father called from the doorway. Ready, I said, turning away from the past and towards something much brighter. Let's build something real. The morning of the community center's opening, I found my father in Petra's old rose garden, now transformed into a vibrant butterfly sanctuary. Monarchs and swallowtails danced around him as he adjusted his tie. Nervous? I asked, helping him straighten his collar. Proud, he corrected, though I wish your mother could see this. A familiar ache, but softer now. She'd probably say we're both too stubborn for our own good. She'd be right. He gestured to the gathering crowd. Quite a turnout. Families streamed through the gates, children running ahead to explore the new exhibits. Leandro directed visitors toward the wetlands observation deck, while Yasmin handed out program guides. Mrs. Rodriguez's entire fourth grade class is here, Brendan reported, joining us. They're excited about the interactive pollution display. Speaking of pollution, I nodded toward a group of suited executives touring the grounds. Look who showed up. Competing manufacturers. My father recognized them, probably worried we'll expose their violations next. They should be worried. I checked my watch. Ready for your speech? He wheeled himself toward the podium we'd set up near the butterfly sanctuary. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. New life emerging from what Petra had tried to control. Before we start, he said as I helped adjust the microphone, there's something you should see. He handed me an envelope. Inside was a letter from Petra, postmarked from prison. Dear Claire, the butterfly sanctuary was a clever choice. I spent years forcing those roses to grow exactly as I wanted, just like I tried to force your father to be who I needed him to be. But you've shown me that real beauty comes from letting things transform naturally. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve it, but I want you to know that watching you turn all my poison into something meaningful has taught me more than punishment ever could. Take care of him. And the butterflies. Petra. When did this arrive? I asked, folding the letter carefully. Yesterday. He smiled slightly. Karma really does have perfect timing. The ceremony began with Leandro introducing the center's educational programs. Malcolm, now working pro bono for environmental causes, outlined our corporate responsibility initiatives. Each speaker emphasized transformation of the land, the company, ourselves. Finally, it was my father's turn. 12 years ago, he began, I made a terrible mistake. I chose a fiction over truth, control over growth, fear over love. I lost my daughter, my integrity, and nearly lost this company's soul. The crowd hushed, hanging on every word. But sometimes our worst mistakes lead to our best opportunities. My daughter returned not for revenge, but for redemption. She took our family's legacy of environmental destruction and transformed it into a beacon of education and hope. He turned to me, eyes bright. Claire, would you join me? I walked to the podium, butterflies swirling around us both. The future we imagined isn't always the future we need, he continued. I wanted a son to carry on my name. Instead, I got a daughter who carried on something far more important, the courage to change. Brendan stepped forward with a plaque. Together, my father and I unveiled it. The Claire Hansen Environmental Education Center, where transformation takes flight. The applause was interrupted by a commotion at the gate. A group of students rushed in, led by their teacher, the same nurse who had caught Petra trying to alter medical records. Sorry we're late, she called out. The kids insisted on bringing something. Each student carried a native plant or flower. Leandro quickly organized them into a planting ceremony near the butterfly sanctuary. See, my father whispered, sometimes karma brings gifts instead of punishment. As the children planted their contributions, I noticed Malcolm speaking quietly with the competing executives. He caught my eye and gave a subtle thumbs up. They were interested in our corporate responsibility program. Ready to show them the water quality testing station? Brendan asked, grinning. Actually, I looked at my father. I think Dad should do that tour. He knows exactly what they need to hear about changing course before it's too late. The day continued with tours, demonstrations, and countless moments of discovery. I watched children learn about ecosystem protection, executives confront their company's impacts, and community members embrace their role in environmental stewardship. Near sunset, I found myself back in the butterfly sanctuary. A monarch landed on the plaque, its wings catching the last light. You know what Mom would really say? I asked my father, who had wheeled up beside me. She'd say we're not too stubborn. We're just stubborn enough to fix what's broken. Even if it takes 12 years? He asked. Even then, I watched the butterfly take flight, because some things are worth the wait. The monarch soared over the transformed estate, past the wetlands observation deck, over the education center that had once been a mansion built on secrets, and into the future we had finally gotten right, not because of a son who never existed, but because of a daughter who refused to let poison have the final word.